Well, hey, everybody. This is a rehearsal recording of a presentation I'm going to give at a Cloud Foundry meetup group up in Chicago later on this week. So I thought as I'm doing one of my rehearsals, I should record it. So here we are. Well, hey, thanks for having me here. This is actually the first Cloud Foundry meetup I've been to, despite having worked at Pivotal for about half a year now. So, it's a pleasure to be here. I was at DevOps Days up here in Chicago recently. If you haven't checked that conference out, that's definitely a good one to look at. Anyhow, tonight I wanted to go over the idea of making sure that you architect and plan for the right kind of cloud platform. And part of that discussion will be essentially going over what this whole cloud native business is about. What it is and how you can take advantage of it, and I always think most importantly why it is. And so the way of summing this up is to think beyond an accidental platform, because to call something a cloud native platform as it's being used nowadays speaks to the idea that it's sort of a purposeful platform that is kind of a standardized open thing. It's a collection of resources that you have, not really sort of like a thing you've cobbled together and ended up with accidentally, which is a very popular pattern. Before there were many different platforms to choose from, but now there are several platforms to choose from, and it's good to know like why you would choose them, what the requirements are, so forth and so on. Obviously, if you're at a Cloud Foundry group, you're interested in what I think is the best one out there, the platforms that are based on the open source Cloud Foundry. And working for Pivotal Cloud Foundry, a lot of what I talk about will be Pivotal's distro of it, Pivotal Cloud Foundry. But let's get to the conclusions. Before we start, I always like to start with conclusions because it gives me a chance to kind of go over the key things that I want to cover, so that you can think about them, or if you have to leave, you've got a sense of what's going on, and it kind of guides you through what's happening in the presentation. And two, it also reminds me what I was going to talk about. So as we go through this talk, kind of remember back to these, and you can see how the general narrative fits to them. So the first one is, I always think it's important to cover the goals that you have, why you're doing something. And here, I think the goal that we're trying to talk about is what is cloud for? What's our cloud strategy? And I've been suggesting for a couple of years, and I'm going to suggest here that the best thing you can do with cloud, your best cloud strategy, is going to probably focus around improving the way you do custom software development, making it the core business enabler. And by core business enabler, as we'll get into here, what I mean is that the business side of your company, whether it's a for-profit company or a government or a nonprofit, whatever the sort of purpose of the company is, they start to look at using software as the way that creates that business, and they're transforming it, and they're coming up with new business models, ways of interacting with customers and separating from their cash or fulfilling their mission. And software is the critical thing that if it wasn't there, the business wouldn't operate the way that you would think it would. I mean, the stereotypical example here is something like Uber in the taxi and car service business, where software previously didn't work, but because of a phenomenal amount, or a phenomenal type of software, right, like mobile apps and all the backing services for it, it's a completely different business model, and they can change how they do their business from their traditional dispatch, way of doing things. And you can think about examples in other industries like Netflix and e-commerce, as we used to call it, Amazon, online banking, like so forth and so on. And we expect to see this exploding quite a bit, and it's kind of what's driving a lot of business talk nowadays. So getting to that point where you can have a programmable business, if you will, a software-defined business, there have historically been technology problems preventing this, but most of the problems that are preventing it now are meatware problems, people and process problems, where the organization has not changed to fit what the technology can now do. And to that end, like there really are integrated full cloud native platform stacks that take care of lots of these technology problems right now. Like, I mean, I see this when I work with Pivotal customers and prospects all the time, that we have a technology that can help them out and that gets them to the point where they can start worrying about those meatware problems instead. So I'm going to go over what is in those cloud native stacks. And then I'm going to spend the last part of the presentation going over these meatware issues cataloged here. What management needs to do. They always needed to do some of the things I'm going to talk about, but it becomes a bigger priority and focus for them. The types of things they need to do, they need to be much more hands-on in their managing. And there's some portfolio management that needs to occur, so you make sure to free up resources to focus on innovation, right? Not just keeping the lights on. And all throughout the way that you sort of think of a cloud-native lifestyle, a way of doing things, there's this focus on small instead of big. Small batches, smaller releases, small testing that you do, and all of these small things have a way of evening out, smoothing out the risk, and also making it so that you're releasing small bits more frequently instead of having big balls of things that are higher risk and released less frequently. And whenever you're operating at this speed that we'll get into that you want with Cloud Native, where you're releasing weekly, if not daily, there's a tremendous amount of QA, but not just the type of unit testing and traditional QA that you think of, but also QA, if you will, of your design. Is it something people actually want to use, that they're using in the most optimal way? And there's also a lot of QAing of your process that needs to go on so that you can be a learning organization and learn how to use these new technologies and think in this new way. So you have to think about QA a lot more. And finally, with all of these new powers and problems and stacks and all of this stuff, it's important that you look at how your organization is currently structured, because chances are the way it's structured is for a different set of problems, sort of advantages, if you will, and technologies. And if you don't structure your organization correctly, you're going to sort of nip in the bud the potential that you had with doing all of this. And you're not really going to get to that point where you're taking full advantage of the cloud-native technologies and cultures. I guess it's just a singular culture, but there probably are multiple ones. So hi, this is me. I'm Michael Cote. I tend to go by my last name. You can follow me or harass me, whatever you like, in Twitter there. I tend to post most of the things I do and stuff I find interesting there, and it's a nice place to interact with people. Now, of course, there's my email address as well if you prefer that way of doing stuff. I would put my phone number on there, but I don't really answer my phone anymore because I'm special, I guess. So I work in the technical marketing group at Pivotal for Pivotal Cloud Foundry, which I'm sure everyone here at the Cloud Foundry user group is familiar with. I won't go in depth in that. I've been an industry analyst a couple of times, most recently at 451 Research, where I headed up the group that was in charge of infrastructure software, so DevOps and software development, cloud, systems management, all this exciting kind of stuff. And we did a lot of DevOps work when I was there, which has been continuing to this day. And I also worked at RedMonk for about 6 years, a place I was an analyst for first that focuses a lot on emerging technologies. And so at the time, we talked about open source, dynamic languages, cloud, even early DevOps things back when it was agile infrastructure. It's a great place. But those are two firms that I worked at that still put out a tremendous amount of good work. And between those two firms, I worked in corporate strategy and M&A at Dell, helping start up the software group and managing the public cloud that we had when we had it, and then helping manage the cloud strategy that we had. I also had the chance to work on this thing called Project Sputnik, which is still in the market today. It's exciting. It's like a Linux-based desktop if you're interested in that. That was a fun project. And before all of that, I was a software developer for 10 years, from like online banking companies to car dealerships to consumer-based things to systems management software, all over the map. And you can always follow what I'm up to there at cote.io. And I also do a lot of podcasts. If you go to cote.io/podcast.com, I have a weekly one called Software Defined Talk, which is just kind of like trying to deal with the encroaching cynicism of the tech industry and how to cope with it. It's actually not that bad. It's kind of fun. And there's a new one I'm starting up, hopefully sometime soon, under the Lords of Computing banner, about companies who are going through a lot of these transformations and changes and what they're doing. So, as I'll repeat at the end, I'm always interested in talking about tech and what people are doing, and I'd love to talk with you afterwards or whenever we have the time to see what you're up to in the tech world and just compare notes. So feel free to reach out to me. So let's go over. I always think it's good to start with the goals and the problems, the issues, the whatnots and the what have yous that we're doing in IT, because it's easy for us to get lost down in the stack, which is perfectly fine. And there are many other sessions here at these meetups where we go over the exact technologies and things down there. But it's good to have the context of why we're doing things and the goals and the problems that we have to surmount to get to them. So I've been looking at cloud, as you can probably decode from my bio there, for quite some time. And I've noticed that there's a lot of confusion. It's actually getting much better now, but there's a lot of confusion over what cloud is and why you would do it. And the main goal that I like to focus on is that cloud is a way, an excuse, if you will, and a bunch of enabling technologies and school of thought that allows you to start using software as your core enabler of business. Now, I talked a little bit about this in the conclusion slide, but think about all these unicorn companies, like all the kind of companies that you see in the headlines. Whether it's an Uber or a traditional company like a Humana or an Allstate, or someone starting to use software in a new way. And what you'll realize is that many of these companies are not really technology companies. They're not selling software or hardware, right? That's not their product. Or Netflix is another good example, or Amazon, any e-retailer you look at. But what they're doing is they're using software as the core differentiator and process, their factory, if you will, for their business. And as other businesses start to internalize this more and more, which is I don't really go into the business side of things, but you can, down at the bottom, you can get, if you look at those previous presentations and an article I've done, it kind of goes over the business motivations. Purely apart from technology, what's happening in the business world that's motivating businesses to do that, if you need that part of the story. But once businesses want to do this, they want IT that can be released weekly, if not daily, right? It's very agile and very rapid. And this means what that enables them is it allows the software to match what the business as fast as the business model is evolving. So the business can come up with new things that they're doing, new plans, enter new markets, all sorts of things like that. And they want IT to be able to move as quickly as they can come up with new ideas. They want it to be agile, right? So that's one idea of what agile is. And when you have that as the case, IT becomes this enabler of growth, right? It's the thing that you have to do to come up with new business. And that's very positive compared to the cost center sort of thing that IT currently is. And this really gets you to the point. I like to use the phrase software-defined business that I think the Chef people came up with several years ago. You can also think of it as like a programmable business, right? If you're using software so much in your businesses, you're kind of at that point where you can start to program it, which is kind of an interesting thing to think about if you're familiar with programmable infrastructure, and you are allowing business people to change how their business operates. Now, most people, I'm sure no one in this room suffers from this, but most of the people that I end up talking with who are interested in working with Pivotal or using Pivotal Cloud Foundry, and many of the people I talked with when I was an analyst and at Dell, they're definitely not in that software-defined business phase, right? IT is a cost center. It's like the Department of Slow and No, and it always takes like uncountable man months to get even the seemingly smallest changes done, right? Like it's almost as quaint as this clip art that I've got here, right? Where like the idea of IT is just keeping the lights on and making some fancy slides and looking sassy when there's pictures of you, very professional looking people there. And you can tell I love this piece of clip art. But it really is like what this means is that IT is not something that the business looks towards to enable the business, to make business changes or to do anything helpful, right? They're just kind of dismissed. And it's a little wonder that things like SaaS and outsourcing have been so popular, is that IT departments have not really, been as helpful as we would hope they would be. And so to that end, in addition to my sassy clip art to show you, there's some surveys to go over. I always love lots of charts. You can tell I worked in strategy for a while. So there's a survey that the Institute for the Future did down here. It's got a pretty large survey base, and only 25% of the respondents thought that they were innovating in agile ways, that they were agile enough, right? So that's a huge gap between what companies want and what they can do when it comes to being agile. And you can see an even more dramatic thing over in this recent Cutter study, and it's great because it has 3 years of year-over-year data, where the importance of IT for doing business innovation, being a key enabler, has dramatically dropped over the years. So at some point, they were doing pretty good. I mean, I think with a margin of error, 50 to 60% is still pretty crappy, to be honest, but it's better than none, better than 31%. But you can see it's been decreasing, right? So you got this sad cloud guy here, right? Like IT is not really seen as being at the center of what's going on. To help businesses grow. It's very frustrating for companies, and they want more from IT. There's a huge gap there. So if we look at like what are the issues, what's holding things back, and this is another survey from yet another group. You can see the footnote there. It's a pretty large survey base. It seems legit. And you can see that there's a mixture of technology and meatware problems, right? I mean, the first one is sort of like, I think that's always an issue. People just don't have the discipline of having a prioritized backlog, right? Like there's always an issue of priorities and setting strategy. And there's some sort of like, insufficient tech skills and security issues. And there's some technology things, but most of these, if you think about it, are meatware problems, right? They're process problems and organizational problems that need to change. And I think a lot of what holds them back is, you're thinking about, we have enough new technology, as we'll get into, but you have to think about how to use that technology correctly, how to reorganize the way you're doing things, how to set expectations differently and do your planning, which we'll get into at the end of the presentation. But the positive way of looking at a lot of this is that it's possible to solve people problems. It's impossible to solve a technology problem that has no solution, right? Like it takes a lot of work to do like basic research to make things faster. But when something's a people problem, like it's a lot more malleable and hopefully it's a lot harder than just sort of like, writing some software. But it's at least something that can be addressed. And I think being aware that most of our meatware problems kind of shifts your focus around. So when you have these meatware problems, right? I think especially looking at the huge amount, the plethora of technology that's available, there's all sorts of great technology. Companies still have that gap of that agility gap, if you remember from the slide previous to this one, right? IT is not meeting the expectations of business. And I think this is, I call this always Bittman's sad pie of cloud. And it's representative of what I would see as an analyst and see now, is that people are not thinking about how they're using technologies correctly because they have meatware issues, right? And so this is a little conference survey that was done almost a year ago or so. Maybe not almost, but you see we're down there in February. And like it is, and it's also over private cloud, so maybe they should go to public cloud, all sorts of disclaimers. But again, it's very directional and similar to what I see all the time. Is that there's a very small amount of people who kick off on a private cloud project and say that everything's going right. And a lot of the issues are, some of them, 6% is like using the wrong technology. And, that's probably even due to a lot of the other issues that are all, again, meatware issues, right? Like we didn't change the way we use this, the operational model. We didn't do enough. Like we didn't fund this correctly. We were focusing on the wrong benefits. So we weren't thinking about how we were going to do cloud correctly. We didn't have the best cloud strategy. So when we finally did put it in place, it didn't work because there was an impedance mismatch, I guess, between the strategy and the technology, which, no one wants that. And I think a lot of that has to do with the hangover. It's a positive hangover, kind of like a wedding hangover, I guess, of what we've seen in the last 10, 15 years in IT, where virtualization was this great thing that came in, and you didn't really need to change anything. You just needed to virtualize all your physical servers, and you could get tremendous cost savings. You could get tremendous optimizations without really changing anything. You could even speed up how IT was doing, but you didn't really have to change much. And cloud is not like that. Cloud's not like a thing that you swap it in and all of a sudden things go better if you haven't revisited and changed the way that you're doing other things. So I see that pattern play out over and over again. And what I'd like to suggest is that when you're doing cloud, what you really want, you want to get to this end result here. This is my simple model of a continuous delivery pipeline. The activities and sort of like the life cycle of what you see when you're doing custom software. You come up with what to do, you write the code, you test it, and deploy it, and you make sure it runs in production. But there's this feedback loop where you start to observe how the software is running and what people are doing with it. And when you get to the point where you can do this cycle very quickly on week or daily turns, that feedback loop is almost a new thing that we haven't had previously. You can start to hone the software and change it and observe it and change the way your users use it and what it's doing. And if you start thinking about it, that means that you can be as agile as someone wants a business to be. If you're as agile as a business wants to be, if you're deploying on a weekly turn, every week the business can try something new. And if it doesn't work, they've lost a week. Big deal, right? So they can come up with a new partnership, right? Like let's say when I checked into a Starwood hotel here and they partner with Uber and I get points when I drive Uber while I'm staying at a Starwood thing. Like, is that a good idea or not? Well, I don't know. Let's code out the integration and make it run. And does it make me both use Uber more and stay in Starwood hotels more? It certainly does, right? Because I want to get more points. And I mean, that's just one small thing, but think of all the different things you could do if you could just try it out, and all the meetings you've been in where it's sort of like, well, that's going to take several months to do, and people just don't try anything out. So once you get to that point, you can start being more agile. And as the disclaimer says, there actually are a lot of other things to do with cloud that are pure optimization, right? Like there's a lot of packaged software that you should probably just move to SaaS instead of managing and being responsible for. Save a lot of resources there. There's a lot of old, as we'll get into when you're doing portfolio management, old workloads that you can also just move to raw infrastructure and cloud and optimize cost-wise how they're running kind of low priority things. So there are things that you can do, but I would suggest that this is the most valuable thing that you can do with cloud, is really start to become a software producer and start to become a software defined business. So let's get a quick baseline before we jump into the technology of how we're doing, so we can start to see the need, right? So this is one way of looking at it. I try to simplify things down and yet have two charts on one page, huh? But anyways, back when I was at 451, we did a couple of DevOps studies. I wanted to see how DevOps was progressing in the mainstream market. And one of the questions we had in the first study was around how much continuous integration and delivery are you doing? Like, what are you using tools? And you can see there's this shocking 30% of the market, 28, let's say 25 to 30% of the market doing nothing, which is sort of mind-boggling considering how old continuous delivery is. So I think we should expect, sorry, in the recording I was getting a message, but let me just go on. I think we should expect to see a lot more use of continuous delivery, because it's a proven thing that's been around some time before cloud or DevOps or all of this, but there's this huge chunk that's missing there. Now there is that 25 to 30% that's doing something, so that's encouraging. And then let's give the benefit of the doubt to the DIY people. Sure, they've built their own thing to do continuous delivery, and they're doing fine there instead of using a third-party product. I mean, I always joke that if you're doing so well with your own thing, you should probably quit your normal job and do a startup with that product instead of cobbling it together on your own. It might also be open source usage instead of products, but anyways. The second one, I think, gives better clarification to this, which is to say that it's a nice year-over-year study, which is always a better thing, looking at charts to have comparison. And D-Zone did these studies. And you can see there's a lot of people, it's been improving, who think they're doing CD, right, continuous delivery, half of the market, if you will. And that's grown quite a bit. But then if you go down to textbook continuous delivery, which I think is done by Martin Fowler's kind of stringent rules of continuous delivery, which includes the ability to deploy automatically and all sorts of things like that, it dramatically decreases, right? Now it has been increasing quite a bit, but it's still a small part of the market. So somewhere in between these two charts, you get the sense that there's a lot of improvement to be had, right? We need to accelerate our ability to get to a continuous delivery pipeline, which is exactly what I want to suggest all this cloud native nonsense does for you, right? A cloud native platform is a good accelerant for for getting to that point where you can do continuous delivery. It's a lot more than just using Jenkins or Bamboo or Travis CI or whatever, but it's going to speed up and automate a tremendous amount of the things that are slowing you down, and that's really a lot of what the cloud native, all the cloud native, whether it's culture or technology, is looking to do is to speed things up if you're willing to go through the meatware changes for it. So let's start with the technologies. So like I was saying, there are great technologies available, right? Like there's no lack of technology if you know about them and you have a good sense of picking the right ones, right? If you just make sure that you don't pick the wrong ones. And when, cloud native is a word that we've been using for a while. One of the people who worked at Pivotal, Matt Stein, came out with a book on migrating to cloud native applications, I think back in April or February of this year. It's a great book you can get for free, by the way. From us. I might even have some left over here I can give out. But it's this idea of, let's take all of the learnings from agile software development, the technologies and stacks from cloud computing, and also some of the development technologies that the sort of like elite of the developer world have been learning and talking about, and put it all into one package, right? And a lot of what you see in the kind of container mania nowadays is very focused on that middle one, the container orchestration and doing workload placement and scheduling and things like that. But what we in the Cloud Foundry ecosystem like to emphasize is that you need all four of these layers, right? You need the development-centric framework, everything that goes there. You need the runtime platform that does all of your orchestration and running your middleware and making sure that you have resiliency and bringing services up and down in middleware. And then also all of the automation that's in cloud native operations, right? Like being able to run on multiple different clouds, deploying your stuff onto those clouds, making sure that they're healthy, doing rolling updates and blue-green testing, and having zero or near zero time updates because of all of this stuff operating together. So you can kind of see how it decomposes, or maybe evolves, to use a more positive word, into Pivotal Cloud Foundry and what we have. But underneath all of this, as I'll get into at the end, is having a cloud native empowered culture, having the right meatware in place that takes advantage of this. Because if you just have this wrapped to basically a lengthy service desk and change review board meeting at the end of being able to deploy, you're not really going to get anywhere. You're gonna, as I like to say, you're gonna buy a Ferrari and just use it to go buy milk at the grocery store. You're not thinking big enough. So let's look at each of these layers, and I'll just briefly go over this because I think most people here are familiar enough with what these layers do, but I want to go over this to kind of talk about how all of this works best when it's integrated together and curated together, rather than sort of cobbled together buffet style, and sort of combined together on your own, because that's really what Cloud Foundry is about, is having this opinionated, curated stack to enable you to live that cloud native lifestyle. So there's the cloud native application frameworks, right? And think of this as the developer layer. Like here, at this day and age, you need to support multiple languages, right? So you want polyglot programming, essentially, to use a phrase that one of my old, the analysts on my team, Jay Lyman, always loved to use. And, in the Cloud Foundry world, there's support for Java, Ruby, Python, Node, PHP, Go, and on and on. And depending on what you have for .NET and Microsoft style coding. And you don't want to restrict your developers to one type of language, or you don't want to have to do that. You might do it for process reasons, but you need that kind of support. You're also going to develop your applications and want your platform to support it being in this 12-factor way, because this, as we'll see, creates a contract. It says, hey, developers, if you write your applications this way, the cloud runtime can run it, right? It can be cloud ready instead of not being cloud ready. So this has a lot to say about how you deal with networking and ports and state in your system and things like that, and deployment, and how you manage your code. There's a lot going on there that's useful. And microservices really define the service orientation that you have, because you want to have that service-oriented way of doing things. But as we'll get into, when you start to think about small batches of services that are loosely coupled, there are some management concerns that you have when they're not so tightly coupled together. And microservices are this very emergent and learned way. They've been emergent over recent years, and it's a new approach to doing service-oriented design, essentially, that's been working quite well. And you really want your cloud platform to support how that is running. For example, we use Spring Boot and Spring Cloud to be kind of like the life cycle, the creation, and then the running and management of microservices. It sucks in a lot of the Netflix open source projects where they were some of the early inventors of some of the microservice patterns. And also, you want to have as much built into the platform as possible, not only built in so that you have that functionality, but so that it runs in your cloud platform, right? You want to have middleware that is integrated and written to run on the runtime and to run on the cloud platform. And so, in Pivotal Cloud Foundry, we have over 30 middleware services, from databases like MySQL to mobile services for notifications and queues and continuous delivery pipelines and so forth and so on, right? And again, these are things you can get off the web, if you will, off the shelf, but then you have to figure out how to integrate them together and make sure that they work. But it's better to have your platform figure out how to have that stuff integrated out of the box, like you see in cloud platforms. And there's a list of lots of microservice patterns and things that we have there. And of course, you want all your enterprise-grade fault tolerance and things like that. Now, just briefly, if you're not familiar with 12-factor app principles, it's very important for how you think about how you do your programs, right? Like, just to pick on a few of them, doing a process-oriented way of doing your application, stringing together processes in kind of a Unix and Linux style, making your build, release, and run builds in parity as much as possible, thinking about how you manage and configure backing services and how that's injected into there at runtime, and on and on and on. And so this is again the contract developers have. They write their applications in this way, and it allows them to be microservices, and also it allows them to run correctly in a cloud context. So going down to the cloud native runtime platform layer. So this is the layer that runs the applications. It sits on top of the infrastructure and runs the middleware, provides middleware for you. It schedules processes running everywhere. It orchestrates everything, if you will. And there's a lot of general principles you want here, right? Like one of the ones that's often forgotten is way there at the bottom, kind of representative of it being forgotten, is you want to have identity and access management built into it, right? Like every developer loves to write their own identity management system, which is a hilarious waste of time. But you want to have not only sort of, identity systems to call upon, but especially in enterprise situations, you want to make sure you've got all the role-based authentication and audit and controls over identity and things like that. So in Cloud Foundry land, we have the Elastic Runtime, which is the current, runtime layer here. And then that's being rewritten in Diego. And there's some great presentations going over how that's changing just a little bit. It's mostly just terminology change. For an end user, it's essentially the same. And then there's also the idea to help out with the life cycle of Lattice, which is sort of taking some of the bits of Diego and making it so it's a very self-contained, runnable on your desktop type of system. So there's a lot to offer there. And again, all of this integrates upward to the development part, right? And downward to the section that we'll be looking at next. And here's just a quick architectural overview of what we have in the Elastic Runtime to drive the point home, right? I'm sure people here are familiar with that, but you can see there's a lot going on of managing your containers, having the logs, the configuration serving, the identity. And the point is, all of these things are things you could cobble together on your own, but it's probably better to have a way of having them integrated into a unified cloud-native platform. And that's why we speak of a platform, right? Instead of just sort of like a collection of resources. So now let's look at the final layer, that is cloud-native operations. And this layer is I wanted to go over it a little bit because it's often a little confusing and misunderstood, but it's really the layer that enables you to have the runtime and therefore the cloud-native applications on top running on top of any type of infrastructure that you have, right? So, with Cloud Foundry, we can run on AWS or vSphere, we can run on OpenStack or Google's cloud and so forth and so on. And it describes how to create new services and automate the provisioning and the configuration and the upgrading of those services. It has built-in health for making sure that all the nodes in your network can come up and down. And it really facilitates a lot of the magic of having canary deployments, seeing if something is going to work and rolling back, and blue-green deployments. A lot of that configuration management is built in there at the Bosch level, which is an important part of it. Now, what exactly does Bosch do? I think if you look at the interfaces you have to implement to enable a new type of infrastructure for Bosch to manage, right? So if a new type of cloud comes along, here's the cloud, I forget what CPI stands for, but the cloud provider interface. You implement this, and this goes back to whatever cloud you have and does all of the work, right? So you can see there's storage management, there's creating networks, there's creating VMs, and creating the disk images, the stem cells that are used, right? So this gives you a sense of what this automation layer does. And furthermore, you can look at the basics of what's in Bosch here, right? Sort of starting up your VMs, monitoring the health, and so forth and so on. I think maybe I'll take these diagrams out, or just leave them in. But this gives you another view of what's going on at that layer. So to sum up, to grossly simplify it, right? If you look at a cloud-native platform, there's really 3 layers to it. And this layering approach is what gets lots of the flexibility, right? It's what allows for running on any cloud. It's what allows for multi-tenancy. It's what allows for the speed of using containers and allows for microservices and all of this. And resting underneath all of it is culture, right? But there's contracts between each layer that essentially say, if the layers above me operate in this way, I can guarantee that I'll operate in this service-friendly way, and so forth and so on. You can see the different technologies that we have in pivotal Cloud Foundry land that map to those layers. But keep this in mind, that whenever you do your cloud native approach, you're going to end up with a platform, whether you create it on your own or you get one from like Cloud Foundry. And it's really this integration, this contract between them that makes it all work and run together. It's what I always like to call a 1 + 1 = 3 situation, right? All of these things together, working coordinated, are much more powerful than miscellaneous things cobbled together. So let's get on to the meatware to wrap up with. So I've gone over, the idea of a cloud-native platform is that we have the technology it takes to start being a software-defined business, to close that agility gap of what businesses want from IT. But once you put this technology in place, as we and our customers have been finding, and as I was observing when I was an analyst, there's a lot more work that needs to be done in the meatware space beyond the technology. So first, let's look at one of the responsibilities that management has and how that changes. Now, management is responsible for creating the game, if you will. And once you have this stack in place, as I was saying, the way you operate is going to change. So management has to become an expert at change management. And this is a daily, weekly thing they need to do, is think about how they're managing the change in the organization. One of the other things that I noticed that has to happen a lot more is they need to be a lot more upfront and communicative, if you will, about setting goals and tracking them. So a lot of companies I've worked in and consulted with and talked with before, they're not really as good as they can be about setting goals. So I get in conversations all the time with companies who say they need to come up with the cloud strategy, and just after asking them a series of questions, it's clear that management hasn't really communicated why or what they want to accomplish with it. So it really is management's responsibility, again, to create that game, to garden it and come up with it. And to that end, there's a lot of this thinking is in that book, Leading the Transformation, which is an excellent recent book that's come out. I can't recommend it enough. It goes over a lot of these things. And there's an older but equally good book, The Concise Executive Guide to Agile, which goes over how management can start thinking about how Agile works when you're releasing on a weekly cycle and dealing with the kind of agile software development that a cloud native approach gives you. Has like metrics and all sorts of case studies. It's extremely brief, so it's a good read. Now, one thing that the management does need to do as part of the change management is they need to do the dramatic organizational changes we'll get to at the end gradually, right? Like, you can't just expect all of this to work overnight. You need to start small and kind of eke it out, right? And as one example of this, to kind of, pace mainstream people with a lot of what you would read every day, is like, you do want to eventually have these self-directed teams, right? Very harmoniously operating self-directed teams. But it's been my experience that that's something you have to train for. If you don't already have self-directed teams, right, management needs to figure out how to train up and manage to that point, right? It's change management that they need to do. They need to do it safely and securely and all of that. You can't just send people to training, Scrum training or even sort of cloud training, if you will, and they come back the next week and they're all ready to go. It's a process to really walk through. And I started a series of blogs going over the cloud native journey. I just published the first major part of it. I have an overview that summarizes it, but it goes over greenfield application things, legacy, and then transformation. And you can start following that along. And I'm trying to collect together all the tips like these that I've been finding over time. But there's lots of resources that management can consult when it comes to figuring out how the game changes and what they're responsible for doing. Now, another thing that management and strategy people and planning people need to start doing in the IT department is more actively managing their portfolio, right? So as I've alluded to already, you're going to have parts of your portfolio that are just existing IT that maybe don't really need to operate in this kind of evolutionary mode or revolutionary mode, if you will. They don't need to evolve or change that much, and you really just need to crank the screws of optimizing them, moving them onto cheaper infrastructure, even decommissioning them if they're not used. And what you want to do is you want to very actively manage that non-cloud IT to make sure it doesn't consume all of your time. And at EMC we have a group in the EMC Federation that focuses on this very holistic portfolio management. If you come to Pivotal, we also have a group that allows you to transform your applications into being used in Cloud Foundry. You can see some links below of various things we've published on migrating to Cloud Foundry. But you're not going to migrate everything to Cloud Foundry or to cloud. Some things you'll just maybe, like I was saying earlier, move to SaaS or just virtualize more. And so it's management's job, or someone in the IT department needs to very actively manage this portfolio so that you free up time to focus on the more innovative things, on those growth opportunities, and be agile. Otherwise, you're just going to wake up one day and have so much technical debt from the sort of red side of the curve, if you will, that all you're going to be able to do is keep the lights on. And that's kind of the present state we're in, if you remember the depressing charts. So figure out, if you're not doing portfolio management, you should start doing it. And from people I talk with, most people are not really that far along on doing this. So you've got, what's the planning for a project? How do let's say I've done, all the below and I want to start. I've got a platform in place. Well, what you want to do is pick a small project, if not a small series of projects that almost has guaranteed success, or if you fail at them, no one will notice. You can kind of sweep them under the rugs. And I'm sure no one here works in a typically caustic corporate culture where failure is not celebrated, and having a series of failures of projects, as I like to joke, is a sure way to go from VP of having a P&L to VP of special projects, which is not always, but usually a demotion for people. And that is, failure is not celebrated, if you will. The idea of failing fast in normal companies is not well liked. Now, of course, when people in the tech world talk about failing fast, what they mean is learning, right? Like, learning is typically a series of failure where you try something out, fail at it, and figure out what to do next. And you evolve, and you are always honing and making something better. Now, I still need to change this 3% thing because they had 3% and wanted 10 and then got to 30%. So now once you have this cloud platform in place, pick out some projects that will allow you to build up momentum and success to go do bigger things, right? And there's a Humana keynote from this year's Cloud Foundry Summit that's great if you haven't seen it, where they do exactly this. They had one application Vitality that rewards, their members. I mean, it's a large health insurance company that rewards their members for doing healthy activity. If you exercise more, you get points, which in theory, probably more than in theory, drives more profit for Humana because they have less payouts to do. So they want their people who are covered by them to do healthy activity. And engagement was like at a 3% level, if I remember. And by following a more agile learning cloud native like approach, they drove engagement up to 30%. Now, it was kind of like this moribund application that if they failed at it, wouldn't have had any bad effects, essentially, sort of. And I'm sure people would know, but it was low risk to try it out. Now, because they were successful at that, they went on to a second application, My Health, which helped people who are have diabetics, and other things that they have to they're on plans, help them remember do things and help them encourage them to be healthy. And they were successful at that, again, building up momentum with small projects. And then finally, the one pictured here is they were able to, within 5 weeks, because they were running on Pivotal Cloud Foundry, get Q, which is this health monitoring application, onto the Apple Watch, the day of release of the Apple Watch. And that's a phenomenal success story for a company like Humana, as they go over in their keynote. I mean, if you think about it, could you do that? Could you deploy an application within your company from idea to actually being deployed in 5 weeks? It would probably take that long just to plan and require get the servers you need, right? And there's some more detail as I footnote there in the Concise Executive Guide to Agile about the BMC case study, and also there's actually a heuristic of how to pick projects for small projects for doing here if you're interested in doing that more. So let's look at this idea of smallness, right? There's all sorts of angles to focusing on small instead of big, and I think the main one is that you want to focus on releasing loosely coupled small batches. Now let's pull that apart. So first of all, small batches, if you look at the sort of risk diagrams here, if you're bundling up all of your functionality every 6 to 12 months, you're building this huge amount of risk. Because until it's in production, one, you don't know if it actually works in production because it's never been in production. You might have tested and simulated it. And two, you also don't know if your users actually want it. So the worst risk of all is you develop software that people don't want. Whereas if you're all continually releasing smaller bits of functionality, at most, let's say you're releasing on a weekly cadence, you lose a week, as I was talking about earlier. And this smooths out the risk that you have of all sorts of quality issues and all sorts of things like that. And it's a little counterintuitive, but once you start doing it, you realize that doing a lot of small things in serial ends up being more than big things that you push down the pipe. Because failure in the big model is a lot more impactful than failure in the small model, right? Like it's almost a risk management situation. And again, a lot of that, and specifically in software, when we're talking about software-defined businesses and cloud native, is enabled by this really fast feedback loop at the bottom. If it only takes you a week to go through that pipeline, right, then you get all this feedback about if it's the right way of doing things, whereas normally you'd be used to waiting some time. Now let's look at the loose coupling part. And loose coupling is one of the main advantages that you get with microservices. So in a non-microservices approach, a monolithic approach where everything, all your dependent services are deployed at once, right? You might have a recommendation engine, integration with partners. If you're like in the airline industry, like integrating with Sabre, I mean, all sorts of things that you would be integrating with. And traditionally, you do everything is fully integrated together and released as one big ball at once, right? And that tends to work at first and actually be pretty fast to work with because you don't have to manage the dependencies between things. But eventually, as time goes on, you get this metaphoric situation where you're operating as slowly as the slowest component you're depending on. And you end up having this train wreck where the main train is trying to go, but because you've broken things or things are not working on the other lines, this is actually like code branching and merging being illustrated here, but it's a good metaphor for service dependencies as well, because you're having this dependency, you have to slow down and you cause confusion and delay basically, right? It's better to have a model where each of these independent services, where they're more loosely coupled and they can be on their own release train. Now, like I was saying, this means there's a lot more integration issues that you have, right? Like what if a new service is released that breaks an API that you were calling, or even if you're being hygienic and you're not changing the API like that, and you always have backward compatibility, what if the behavior changes? There's all these what ifs if you haven't completely integrated things together. But what this gets you, I mean, a lot of what the platform will do for you, and this is a lot of what the microservices frameworks like Spring Cloud do with patterns like circuit breakers and the close monitoring, and then also just what you get from cloud native operations like the ability to do rolling updates and rollbacks very quickly, is if you have integration problems in production from these independent things, you can just roll back the change, right? And then you can go and fix it and do the integration. But what that means is you're not really held back for releasing functionality on all these independent tracks that are going on here. And take this metaphor and extend it to all sorts of things you're doing, right? Like once you have these independent services that are being run by different teams and they're on their own release schedule and roadmap, then you also have the ability to start composing those applications, composing those services into new applications. And then, indeed, this is how a lot of the web works, right? If you think about it, there's all these different services from different companies, and a lot of the apps that we use every day on our phone are really composed of all these different services on their own roadmap and implemented different ways. And just think how rapid, innovation is in the consumer space. And that's a lot of what you want to shoot for with a microservices approach, having small batches and having this kind of loose coupling thing enabled by the ability to quickly recover from failure and roll back and manage things in the cloud native area. Now, we'll just go over two more things before I wrap up and run out of time here. The other thing that I noticed people being deficient in the meatware space, which translates into process and even tools, is they really don't do enough testing, right? And it's not only this first type of testing, sort of unit testing, and you might call it anti-defect testing, classic kind of testing that we do, which you can always probably do more of, right? It's good to go see what your test coverage is, how automated it is, right? Do you have your continuous integration set up that it's actually testing a full build of your product, right? A full deployment of your product. But you also want to, as this is alluding to, test the operations types of things, right? You want to test uptime and were we able to deploy things correctly? Think of that whole process all the way through into deploying to production as your product and how you would test that and make sure that it can work. And in more advanced cloud native cases, you even see people who, like with the Chaos Monkey, or we have a version of that called the Chaos Lemur, and it goes in and purposely breaks things in production, right? To test things in production to make sure you have resiliency built in. And if you know that's happening in production, you build the system better, and you're also discovering new ways to recover from that test. So you're testing more than just unit testing, but you're definitely doing a tremendous amount of testing. And this is often an area that people have to catch up a lot on, and it can determine a lot of portfolio management if it's just a lost cause to write enough tests for things. But it's very important to have tests and have tests around things. But also, I was saying, there's a testing of the design quality. Is this actually some software that someone wants to use? And in a classic way of doing software development, this is very hard to do. If you're deploying every 6 months, then you're talking about a feedback cycle of kind of like a year or more, and like it's just difficult to really bring. Once you run your design quality tests, like what are you going to do with it? Like wait 2 years before you make changes? But if you're moving on a weekly or daily turn, you can start to get design and user experience involved more and more and observe how people are using your software or not using it and do experiments and improve it, again, with small batches, right? So you can think about how that testing mentality where you're experimenting with something and seeing if it works bleeds back into the design of your project. And finally, as I alluded to with the, what management needs to do, you need to put tests in place to test your process. If once you've management and other people have set the goals and what you want to do and your expectations, are you achieving those goals? And if those tests are failing, like if we've been at this for a while and we haven't increased user engagement, revenue hasn't increased, or we haven't brought downtime down, or we don't have the ability to deploy weekly. Like, why is it failing? You need to investigate why it's not happening. So your process is part of the product, right? It's almost as important, if not more important than the actual technologies you're using, depending on your situation. And you have to think about improvement as one of the the test things that you have, a test case that you have, which is largely the responsibility of management types to be the QA people on the process, if you think about it. And you would like to get to the point where everyone sees that as their job, and that's one of those things that you kind of eke into there as your organization matures. So speaking of the organization, before we get to a final example and wrap up, we have, just as proof of the momentum and therefore the data points that we have, we've got about, I think, around 40 or so customers, if not more, and about $100 million annual run rate at the moment in Pivotal Cloud Foundry, as we announced last week. And we're noticing that as companies use the cloud-native platform of Pivotal Cloud Foundry, their organization changes. And this should really kind of be maybe like a triangle, because as you go down this stack, there are fewer and fewer people involved who are managing larger amounts of things. So at the top, you have the application-centric teams that are focused on innovating things and really getting to that idea of a software-defined business. And this really is an integrated cross-functional team. Like, I'm sure you heard people say that, but they really mean it. That you have one team that's responsible for a product that has the developers, the product owner, the QA people, operations people that are needed to understand how all this stuff will operate and run in a cloud context, and also the operations people who can help out run it and manage it in production, right? You want to have the team who made this thing responsible for running it in production, which has been a trick that Amazon has been talking about for years that for some reason people don't believe, right? But it really does change the way that you write your application if you're responsible for making sure it's up and running. Now, underneath that, there are the people who write code for the cloud platform itself, right? So they write what we would call backing services in the Cloud Foundry area. I cited them earlier, but you have like Sabre or a booking system, and someone needs to write a service that wraps around that and provides it to all the people in there. You might have a proprietary inventory management system, and that's a shared service that all the people above the application developers are going to be using. So you need to have someone who's responsible for that and knows how to write it so the platform can manage it, knows how to write a backing service. Then underneath that, you have an even smaller amount of people who are responsible for running your actual cloud-native platform. Whether they're SREs or you call them platform operators, as we do, they actually run your Pivotal Cloud Foundry or Cloud Foundry instance. And they're responsible for setting all that up and configuring it, for upgrading the platform itself. And, they do take in requirements from the upper layers as well as far as functionality that's needed. But, this is usually a pretty small set of people compared to the amount of operators that you need at the moment, like a dramatically smaller amount of people. There's one government agency that has a Cloud Foundry instance, and they have just 2 operators for many applications that they are running on top of that. And I always forget the figures that we have for the public instance of Pivotal Cloud Foundry that we have, but the overall team responsible for that is somewhere in the order of something like 5 or 10 actual operator types, and then 10 or more supporting staff around them for thousands and thousands of applications that we support on top of Pivotal Web Services. But it's a small amount of people that you need there, but you still need people even though most everything is automated. And then of course there are the people who set up the servers and manage the physical racks and infrastructures and are kind of configuring things, and BIOS needs to be updated every now and then. So there is some physical management down there. But once you set that stuff up, it's very much, it's cloud infrastructure. It's very highly automated and scalable by orders of magnitude. So start thinking about as you go down your cloud native journey and you're putting this platform in place, right? When you've gotten beyond an accidental platform, your organization itself is part of that platform, and you need to very purposely change how your organization is structured to match this way of operating, right? Otherwise, if you keep your organization in the old way and it doesn't map to how what the technology is enabling and the agility that the business is going to want you to have, you're going to cancel out the benefits if you're operating in this old way. Now, just as one example that it actually does work, just very quickly, there's Pivotal Labs wrote this application that allowed you to see if there were negative effects of mixing your drugs together, prescription and otherwise. If I'm on this one prescription drug and I want to go on a bender and drink myself a bottle of Jack Daniels, is it going to kill me? Or if I get this new prescription and I have this other prescription drug, are they going to conflict with each other? And there's this database that the FDA put out that in pretty fine detail goes over the adverse conflictions between drugs. So they wanted to take just like a week or so, around 5 or 8 days, and basically write an application that would allow you to see what the negative effects were. Can I go on a bender? I like that example, but can I mix these two drugs together and have a good effect? This is particularly good if people have kids. You always have to be very aware of mixing medication for that they might be on for the constant sicknesses they have. And what I want to point out here is not so much the application that they developed and the fact that they did it in a very agile fashion like you would expect Photo Labs to do, who are multi-decade veterans of doing agile. They're very disciplined, and people learn from them. It's a great thing if you want to witness agile in one of its purest forms to go work with them. But there's this one part that I've highlighted that's basically everything we've been talking about in one bullet point. I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit. The ability for them to deploy to production each day and observe it and update it and for it to run is also part of that. But on the first day, they were up and running with their development and production environments. They got all the infrastructure that they wanted. They knew the programming models to use. They had all the tools. Everything was defined out of the box on day one. And that's because they had a cloud platform in place, and they were following this cloud platform mentality, including the meatware part of it, right? They had standardized on a way of doing this, and that allowed them to spend all of their time on the application layer, right? I mean, they had to do some wrangling with the API to make it work. But think about this. I mean, they called up and interviewed actual users and improved the software. And it's a great example of actually coming up with an idea of an application and getting it out the door in a phenomenal rate of time, because you have both the technology and the meatware that it takes to be, do the cloud native lifestyle. And you can click on the links below there. They've got a nice scrapbook, and you can read through a detailed presentation of what it was and actually go see the application if you want to. So with that, thanks for the chance to go over all this stuff with you. As I said at the beginning, I'm always interested in hearing what people think of this, what they're encountering as they're trying to use software more and more of part of their business. What's holding them back, issues that they have. I mean, it really is the thing that I personally like to study, and professionally I study as well. Because this excerpt from the Agile Manifesto a long time ago is really it's a huge part of what attracted me to Pivotal and makes me want to study software. Is I'm really interested in figuring out making software suck a little less, right? How to improve it and communicating and helping other people do it. Because just like all of you, I have to use software every day, and as we're seeing, software is more and more a part of almost every minute of our life. And if we don't improve it and fill that agility gap, we're in for a lot of terrible software in the future. So, with that, I'm happy to take questions with the time remaining, and maybe even go out and talk with people more. Or you can follow up with me in email, and you can download the slides on that URL there. All sorts of ways to contact me, and it's been a pleasure talking with you guys. Thank you very much.